bought my hometown newspaper yesterday, Tacoma News Tribune, and in looking back, a South Sound history through words and pictures, 100 years ago today, June 23rd, that was yesterday, 90 pioneer men and women of the state of Washington met in Seattle at their annual reunion, 100 years ago yesterday. Thomas Jefferson recommended that some action be taken so that the association could obtain recognition from some public-spirited citizens, that steps might be taken for the preservation of the historic interests of the future. So I think we're doing that, aren't we, 100 years later? I hope. Anyway, this will go into our historic record down here, our scrapbook.
So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, and a lot of you are probably familiar with Junius Rochester, but even if you are or aren't, it's worth noting that he is a noted local historian and author. He's written several books and articles on local history and beyond, and he has been a former past president of the Northwest Historians Guild and was one of their presenters at their conference this spring. He's accomplished a lot of things in his life, and I'm very happy we had him as a speaker today, not just because he's a member of our board or because he has such a depth of knowledge in Lewis and Clark and Thomas Jefferson and those things that impacted our area. We had him because he is a very passionate and very enthusiastic lover of history, and he's somebody who really brings that history alive, which is a gift to us, and it's something we're trying to do here every day. So it's my pleasure to introduce Junius Rochester.
If it's all right with you, I'll use the mic because there may be a few other people besides myself that are a little deaf in one ear or the other. I found it works better this way. The subject today is Tom Jefferson, one of the most interesting people ever to come out of the United States history. But whether he was the best president or not the best president, I leave to you to decide. He was controversial in his time, but which president is not controversial in their time? His decisions were momentous, at least in his first administration. His second administration was a little quieter. He was considered a so-so governor. He was considered a very interesting representative of the United States in France. He was considered a young and full of life member of the House of Burgesses, which is the equivalent of the of course, the House of Representatives or the Senate in our terms. He was vice president, not very distinguished, but he was also the first Secretary of State under George Washington. So his background is fascinating. And what he gave to our country has resonated out here. It's part of our world in the West, and that's really the subject of my talk, Tom Jefferson and the West. But before I get into those kinds of things, let me say a couple of words about Tom in general, so you understand this President of the United States, where he came from, what kinds of things interested him. The interesting thing about Jefferson was that he was born in Virginia, and he was always considered himself a Virginian. Now that may sound strange to all of us. We consider ourselves Americans, although we are living here and living there, and our family came from this place. In those days, you were a Massachusettsite, you were a New Jerseyite, you were a Pennsylvanian, and you were a Virginian. And Jefferson was very proud to say he was a Virginian. And he never lost that connection. He always was associated with Virginia, and he, in a sense, established a kind of a dynasty in American politics out of the state of Virginia. There have been a number of presidents from Virginia, by the way, right up to and including Woodrow Wilson, who, if it might surprise you, was born in Stanton, Virginia. He wasn't part of that famous dynasty of the days of the Revolution, but he was a Virginian. And of course, there was Monroe and a number of others, all of whom knew each other well, all of whom fought, if you will, on the same side, which is for the Revolution in their time. Although later on, as the country matured, developed, and expanded, they began to factionalize. They began to disagree on a number of things. One of the most interesting parts of that is the question of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Very close, very good friends. Both brilliant, interesting letter writers, stayed in touch for years. until the so-called Democrat-Republican Party. It's not quite the Republican Party of today. It was called the Democrat-Republican Party of Jefferson, although he didn't think he was forming a party. He just wanted to oppose the Federalists, most of whom dominated the New England scene. And that was the beginning of a kind of a split, a schism between not only New Englanders and Virginians, but also between, unfortunately, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. But interestingly enough, Jefferson kept up a correspondence, even after that, with Abigail Adams. Abigail Adams was a woman of note. She was an equal partner to John. And you know, there's a couple of biographies of her out now, and I encourage you to take a look at them. They shared everything having to do with the growth of our country and the changes that occurred. And Jefferson liked to communicate with her. He stayed in touch. After about 13 years, after the country had developed, after the Democratic-Republican Party was in power, that is Jefferson's people, they resumed their correspondence, Adams and Jefferson. And those letters are among the most cherished documents in America today. By the way, you may know this, they both died on the same day, July 4th. And when Jefferson was lingering on his deathbed, Adams knew that he was about to go, and just before he expired, it was said by somebody who was there, maybe apocryphal, Jefferson still lives. And then Jefferson died later that day. So the connection between these men and the Revolutionary time is just fascinating, very, very interesting. First, a little bit about Jefferson so you get a picture of him as a human being. I deal in history all the time. I love it. I write it. I speak about it. And I think if you don't emphasize the human aspect, it can be pretty dry. I think some of you may recall your courses in high school or college or wherever, or even in elementary school, where you were being taught, quote unquote, history. If it was names and dates and places, forget it. Some of you were pretty good. You remember those things and you passed your tests, but not an awful lot of it was retained and it was a little bit dull. I've had people come up to me on cruise ships who just are so excited because I go into the personalities of these people. They said, oh, I know that person, but I didn't know he did this or they did that or she did this, she did that, and so forth. So I think it has some fun. Let me talk about Jefferson a little bit as a human being. There's a couple of books, recent books that have been written about him. One of the most interesting is by a man named Joseph Ellis. You may have heard of Joseph Ellis. He's written several books about the Revolutionary period. He wrote a book, and the title of his book says something about Jefferson. It's called American Sphinx. American Sphinx. Who was Jefferson? Many people have never figured it out. He was an enigma. He was admired in his time. He was despised in his time. By the way, if you think politics are rough today, if you think they're partisan today, I'd like to take you back to the time of Thomas Jefferson, when they used to write stories about him that were clearly incorrect, who were lies, used to get away with it, and call him every name in the book. Every name in the book. How did Jefferson handle it? Unlike some of our politicians today, although some do handle it this way, he never responded. He never said a word. But he did occasionally ask some of his lieutenants, associates, fellow governors, members of his cabinet, would you mind writing a letter? Would you mind having a talk with this individual? So he had that little duty carried off by somebody else. He's a clever guy, very clever guy. Some people think Jefferson was too smart for his britches, if I'm to put it that way. Well, he was a brilliant man, there's no question about it, and he was bubbling with ideas. He was a child of the Enlightenment. Let me remind you about the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a growth of learning, a fascination with getting truth and facts. It happened, by the way, in most of the industrialized countries of the world. It really started in Scotland, to be frank with you, and then went on to England, France, and it was the beginning of associations that were debating society. It was the beginning of universities. It was the beginning of clubs, mostly men's clubs, that would discuss politics, and it helped foment, to some degree, the American Revolution. People wanted the truth. People wanted answers to things that were accurate. And of course, it led to the French Revolution, which at first Jefferson and many others supported. It seemed to follow in the path of their own until it turned very, very bloody under Robespierre. Then Jefferson got very quiet about the French Revolution. But the French Revolution was, in fact, also a child, if you will, of the Enlightenment. In the Enlightenment, people, by the way, yes, sir?
Very interesting fact this morning in the New York Times. Jefferson witnessed the storming of the Bastille.
Yes, he was in France.
Right.
Yeah, he was a minister to France. You heard that. Jefferson witnessed some of this upheaval himself, personally. He did said something about France, by the way, speaking of Jefferson in France. Jefferson did not like the English. This is talking about the adult Jefferson now. I'm getting ahead of my story a little bit, but as long as this has been raised, he did not like the English. He liked the French. People wondered why. His mother was English. Well, I must tell you something. He really didn't like his mother very much. They didn't get along. It was very sad. Very few historians have been able to find out why there was tension and even disinterest on the part of Jefferson towards his mother. I don't know if it was her personality, if she was a strict disciplinarian. The best biographers have not been able to figure this out. He loved his father, Peter Jefferson, surveyor, but his father was Welsh. There was another reason that maybe Jefferson liked the French. He didn't owe any Frenchmen any money, but he owed a lot of money to English creditors in London. Possibly, because the story of Jefferson is also one of being land rich and cash poor. Tough place to be in. It eventually led to him losing Monticello, not him, but his family losing Monticello. Jefferson liked to use surrogates a lot, and his favorite surrogate, representative, if you will, in a lot of issues, was James Madison. James Madison followed him in the presidency. James Madison was a tiny little fellow, if I may put it that way. Jefferson was tall, 6'3", they say, wiry, blondish when he was young, later turned kind of gray blonde, rode a horse almost every day of his life. That was his exercise. Madison was more of the intellectual type, stayed in his study a lot, was not much of a speaker, by the way, nor was Jefferson. Jefferson was, if you can believe this, shy. He would probably have trouble doing what I'm doing. I tend not to be shy. But Jefferson would probably have trouble standing up here. In fact, when he gave his first inaugural address, after he was elected president the first time, he stood up before the members of Congress and he said, thank you very much. They didn't hear a word he said. Not a word he said. And until it was written and published and circulated, it didn't have any meaning to anybody at that time. Jefferson was that kind of person, but behind the scenes, he knew how to operate, if you will. Jefferson is a young man, we don't know why, but just to give a little more human aspect to him, he had migraine headaches, very serious headaches. He was complaining about them a lot. They eventually went away later in life, but they were intermittent, and they actually caused him not to be able to function when he was a young man. He didn't have a great sense of humor. If you read his talks, Jefferson didn't write or say anything that you could call a knee slapper. He would bend things a little bit. He left it to others to come up with the funny stuff. So I have had to deduce that he was not really a guy with a great humor. But he observed everything, and he wrote everything down. He came from Albemarle County. Albemarle County, by the way, even to this day, is a very important county in Virginia. I encourage you to go visit there. It's also where a couple of friends of his who accomplished great things in our country came from. One was Meriwether Lewis, and the other was William Clark, and many others. But he knew them from the county. In those days, besides being a Virginian, you were part of a county. That was your local area, and you were loyal to it. He was born in 1743, and as I said before, he died July 4th, 1826. Let's take a look at his education just for a couple of minutes. Jefferson may have been one of the best educated presidents we ever had, which should be a surprise to some of you when you consider the fact that there weren't many universities or schools of high note or quality in his time, but he was privately tutored. And one of the people that tutored him was a man named James Morey, M-A-U-R-Y. James Morey, the Reverend James Morey, was an Episcopal minister, a close friend of Peter Jefferson, Jefferson's father. And Morey knew languages, knew the sciences, and had a great interest in the humanities. Jefferson learned to speak French. He perfected it when he went to France later on, to some extent. He also spoke a little Spanish, a little German, and he read in the original the plays and the writings of Greek and Latin writers. He could read them. Whether he spoke those languages fluently, I don't think he did, but he could read them. So his library, which is a major part of his life was part of books. Books and Jefferson were the same thing, had all these languages in it. He also, by the way, had some influence from Maury having to do with the West, which is what I emphasize in this talk. Jefferson was always looking west, and Maury, one of his tutors, the most important tutor perhaps in his life, emphasized the fact that the United States had a long way to go. Cross that Mississippi and keep going, and you end up right here in Madison Park. So anyway, Jefferson was curious about that, very curious about that. So it was part of him. And then I had an interesting experience. Just by the way, the last couple of days, I've been out of town a few days. I came back and there was an interesting email from one of our members. I called Gary about it. Her name is Marilyn Arcavala. Thank you, Gary. I've not met her, but apparently she does not live in this area, but she's done some writing and some research on Jefferson and comes up here, am I right, to do a little research in the Fisk Library. She sent in a connecting note on this about Jefferson as a young man, that Jefferson's interest in rivers, which he was always fascinated by, may have stemmed from the fact that people close to him were exploring the rivers of Virginia and beyond, sometimes at the risk of their lives because the Indians were not friendly in those days. And Jefferson got interested in where the rivers came from, how they worked, how they moved, and whether in fact some of them or one of them might be the so-called Northwest Passage, connecting the great South Sea, which is the Pacific Ocean, with the Atlantic Ocean, with which he was very familiar, of course. Jefferson went on to study law, but at first he went to William and Mary College. He's one of the most august and famous graduates of William and Mary, which is still doing very well, of course. Jefferson then went on to actually practice law for a long period of time, and he served a period of time in the House of Burgesses. That was his first taste of politics. House of Burgesses still exists today, uses the same name, and he was very familiar with not only how politics worked at the basic level of government, which is the county, but he also learned how to deal with people. Usually his style was quiet in the back rooms over lunches and dinners. That's how Jefferson developed his style. His books, by the way, became very important not only to him, but to our country. Jefferson's book collection may have been, in his time, as an adult later on, one of the finest book collections in the United States of America. In 1812, the British came through, burned a lot of Washington, including what was then called the beginning of the Library of Congress. Jefferson then sold his almost his entire collection, not all, he kept some favorites, to the U.S. government. Now I say sold, and you might sound that sounds a little greedy and acquisitive, but he sold it at a bargain basement rate. And it was the beginning of the Library of Congress today. If you go to Washington, D.C., you want to go to the Library of Congress, one of the most beautiful buildings in Washington, D.C., by the way, right behind the Capitol. You can go in there and ask to see one of the books from Jefferson's original. They'll give you a pair of white gloves and put you in a room and keep an eye on you. And you can go in and look at one of Jefferson's original volumes. So the Library of Congress owes a good deal to Jefferson. The question of the rivers was always part of Jefferson's world. Jefferson was raised on a river, by the way, called the Rivanna. Rivanna is a small river that ran through the plantations that his father owned, later he and his wife owned. And he dammed them up, he played with them, he still sort of tried to see if he could divert them here and there. The reason was he wanted to see what the point of an artery like that was in getting transportation underway. He had in mind commerce, moving things, connecting people to other people, connecting the Indian nations to the white people, and so forth. And that's one of the reasons, only one, that he sent Meriwether Lewis west, was to explore the Missouri River and all the parts of it and find out where it started. And also find out where the Columbia River began and why and how it flowed the other way down to the Pacific Ocean. He also examined for a little bit the Potomac River. You know the Potomac, right, in the middle of Washington, D.C. He thought that might be the river of the West. It was clearly not so, but he was willing to take a look at it. Jefferson believed that the future of the country lay with farmers. He thought that the big cities where evil and corrupt activities were pronounced, and he said the farming community, the small farmer, the crossroads village was the idyllic, perfect future of America. Maybe he was right. I leave it to you to make your own decision on that. Today, farming is very, very important. We've had a reference to it earlier today. And small communities, especially in the Midwest and even in our part of the Pacific Northwest, are the backbone of the United States in many respects. But the cities have become dominant in the cultural activity and the flow of money and so forth. Jefferson didn't anticipate that, I don't think, because he didn't think the cities were a very wise thing for people to spend too much time in. He also had another view of our West. By our West, I mean everything west of the Mississippi River. It was a romantic view, at least it seemed to be on the surface. Jefferson wanted to know what was there, and he sent more than just Meriwether Lewis out west. He sent Stephen Long, at least he planned his trip. He sent Zebulon Pike of Pike's Peak fame out there to explore the Great Basin and other places. So he was curious, and he wanted to know what the answers were. His view was that the West was a garden. You can believe that. That was a tough sell to the Congress. A garden? They didn't see any garden out there. They saw naked savages running around in a dusty place, worthless as far as they were concerned. But what's going on there now? The great corn crops of Iowa and Kansas, the wheat, it was a garden. Whether he was guessing or whether he knew something that nobody else in his time knew, I haven't got any idea. But he called it a garden. He also looked at the Indians as quote unquote noble people. That was not shared by a lot of other Americans at the time. He had met a lot of Indians that his father, Peter Jefferson, used to bring back from his survey excursions up into the Appalachians and so forth. He'd bring the Indians along with him, introduce them. Some of them were in full regalia. Young Jefferson, and his father died, by the way, when he was 9 years old or 10 years old, Jefferson was fascinated. He would sit and look at these people, try to understand what they were saying, ask his father what some of these words were they were using, and that carried right on in his view of the West when he instructed Meriwether Lewis to get down everything he could come across about the cultural, military, sexual, social, every aspect of the Indian nations. He wanted to know it all. He was very, very interested in it. And he said, treat them with respect. And he always did, and his father did too. And it may have been one of the reasons, if I can digress for half a minute, that the Lewis and Clark expedition survived. They did treat Indians with respect. They had a lot of reasons to get tough, and they got firm, but they didn't kill any until on the way back, Meriwether Lewis got into a skirmish on the getting out of the Montana area, and they shot 2 at that point. That was the first time. Jefferson also had in his mind that there was a great mountain out here, a 300-mile-long mountain of salt. Of salt? Where did he get that? We don't know, but I've talked to a number of people in audiences that I've discussed this with and who come from the Midwest, and they say the saline content under many of the Midwest states is very heavy. You go down, you can hit great deposits, salt deposits. How did he know this? And what did it have to do with anything? But he said to Meriwether Lewis and others, watch for this great mountain of salt. He also thought that in the West, right out here and beyond, right to the coast, great mastodons were lumbering across the ground. Bump, bump, bump. He had unearthed mastodons when he was a young man in the Rivanna River and elsewhere. He was fascinated by the bones of these great animals. So he was sure one of the last places on Earth that would have mastodons would be out here in the West. He also knew that there was a mountain range out here. It had to be, because the rivers flowed in 2 directions. The Platte, the Missouri, and the rest flowed towards the east, and the Oregon, or now we know it as the Columbia River, flowed towards the west. So in the middle there somewhere was a mountain range. He called it the Stony Mountains. And in his mind, he saw those mountains as the mountains he was looking at in Virginia, the Appalachians. Well, you can imagine what Meriwether Lewis realized when he climbed up at Three Forks, Montana, and looked north, south, west. What did he see? Nothing but snow-capped peaks. He must have said to himself, poor President Jefferson, his dream is shattered. There's no Northwest Passage through this mess. But that's, anyway, what he believed and what he lived by. He also was interested in the Indians as partners in the Western activity, commercial partners. They were our trading partners. They were going to be the source of furs, and the Euro-Americans were going to take the furs east, or they were going to take them west to trade with China, and that's how the United States and a lot of individual entrepreneurs, such as John Jacob Astor, were going to get very rich. So he saw the Indians as an important part of the commercial activity and development of the West. Later on, I must tell you, frankly, that Jefferson made some moves on the Indians when it was time to find land for whites. He tried to cajole, tried to buy, tried to almost beg the Indians if they wouldn't remove and go to this better place up here, better, quote, unquote. Many of the Indians did not like that, opposed him, and when some of his representatives, especially in the South, sent word back that the Indians were getting annoyed by the proposal we've given to them, Jefferson quietly sent a message to them, move them out. Move them out. So you see, he was a practical man, but he was also a romantic man. And he was the same thing having to do with slavery, by the way. He always spoke and wrote in opposition to slavery. You do not find any time where he caves in on that. He did, by the way, propose that the slaves that were in the United States as a way to settle the slavery issue be sent back at government expense to Africa. And that later happened, by the way, under James Monroe, as you know, Liberia. American slaves did go back, many of them there. That was his solution or partial solution. But in fact, he never freed any of his own slaves. He couldn't. He felt he couldn't. Somebody had to work the land, that's all he had. He didn't have a lot of money in the bank. He owed everybody everything, but he had a lot of land. In order to stay afloat, he had to have somebody work that land. So Jefferson was a man of his time. A lot of people say, well, he was a slave owner. Yes, so was Washington, so was Madison, so was Monroe. Most of them owned slaves at one time or another. And in New England, there were slave owners in the early days before abolition became the talk of the Federalist group up there. Jefferson, by the way, although he didn't free any slaves, he did train several of his members of his family, including the Hemings family. You've heard the story about Sally Hemings that he may have had a relationship with, may have sired at least one child by Sally. Some say that he sired all 5 of her children. There's no proof of that, although there is a DNA connection between the two families, because there were some other Jeffersons around. He had a younger brother, he had some cousins and so forth. Who knows? Who knows? But in any case, the Hemings were mulattoes, they were mixed blood, and he spent time and effort training them, and when they had an opportunity to go out in the world and leave wherever plantation they were working on for the Jefferson family, they usually did pretty well, because they knew how to be tailors or cooks or gardeners or managers or whatever. So the Hemings family was an exception to this. A word about his religious interests, which I think is sometimes confused. I hear people occasionally saying, well, especially in this time, I think you see that throughout the world, religious issues are dividing countries and nations and even towns in Africa, the Middle East, here, wherever. And the question of religious differences and religious points of view is again in the news and has been for many years on a national basis and on a local basis. Well, when people say, yes, but we were founded as a Christian country, I offer a little cautionary note on that, a little cautionary note on that. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Monroe, all those, Benjamin Franklin, they were deists. They were deists. They were not Christians, as we know them today. Jefferson did not believe in that Jesus was the Son of God. He did not believe in the virgin birth. He did not believe in the Holy Trinity. as did many of his compatriots, as did Meriwether Lewis and others who came out here. They never had a religious ceremony along the way, even when they lost one of their people. He believed, though, that Jesus was the greatest teacher that ever lived. So he took a couple of the Bibles, and he took his knife, and he cut out all of what he thought were rumor, were miracles, were the songs of Solomon, whatever, and the result was called the Jefferson Bible, and it consisted of 48 pages. That's the Jefferson Bible. Now, many people don't know that or have forgotten that, and so when you get too excited and they say, but we're Christians, this is a Christian country, it's something that you should think about. You should temper your view on that just a little bit. It is a very important Christian country in many respects, but it also has left open the door through our Bill of Rights and otherwise for the free exercise of a lot of other faiths. Jefferson was very, very adamant about that, as a matter of fact. He got this from a variety of sources. One was he was the author, if you will, in 1779 of a bill for establishing religious freedom in Virginia. And part of it quotes as follows: "No man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship whatsoever." That was Jefferson's credo. That's what he believed. And another time he wrote, when somebody said, yes, but we have to have faith, we have to have a strong feeling about the religion of our country, he said, quote, "It does me no injury for my neighbors to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg." Now, that may be a little flash of humor there from our president, but Jefferson believed every person has a right to worship in any manner they see fit. The only limitation, and I think we'd all agree on this, is if you force somebody else or compel somebody else to think as you do. And that lies in a lot of issues that go on right here. The explorations west always had their eye on not only commercial activity, but because he was a scientist at heart, Jefferson wanted to know everything. Benjamin Franklin was the founder, by the way, of the great Philadelphia Institute of Science, the American Philosophical Society, but Jefferson was president of it for 17 years. And Jefferson spent a lot of time bringing people in who were the greatest scientists in the world to give talks, to write papers, to study issues. And so science was the basis of almost everything he undertook, including the explorations west. And that's an important factor because when Lewis was given the assignment, and he wasn't the first, by the way, there were some others who were asked to undertake that project and they backed out. When he was given that assignment, he was sent to Philadelphia and trained by some of the best scientists in Philadelphia at the time at the American Philosophical Society. So when he went out there, he knew how to read the stars. This is Meriwether Lewis. He knew how to use a Linnaean method to categorize a plant or a flower. He knew how to identify the bones, the difference between the bones from an elk to a deer to a muskrat, and all kinds of things. He knew these things, not well, but Meriwether Lewis was pretty good. It was Jefferson's insistence that he do it properly. Now, Jefferson got his ideas not only from his reading and his young tutored years as a student under James Morey and others. He also was influenced by a man named Sir Joseph Banks. Sir Joseph Banks was the president of the Royal Society in England in the time of Cook and later Vancouver, who came through our country, right off the shores here. And Joseph Banks even got aboard the first Cook exploration. And as the president of the Royal Society, he wanted to see that science was properly developed and described and recorded. Jefferson picked up on that. And that had to do with the Enlightenment too. Search for truth, get the right answers, do it the way it should be done. So Jefferson always put science at the top. Jeffersonian democracy is a term we hear a lot. What does it mean? A lot of people say, well, it means small town life. It means what it meant to Jefferson. It doesn't mean much to us anymore. It's changed so much. But the best that I've come across to describe Jeffersonian democracy is this. It's a government that requires the consent of the governed for the governors to proceed. In other words, the consent of the governed must be obtained first before a governor, a representative, a senator, a president can proceed. That's Jeffersonian democracy. He also thought it would only flourish in rural areas, the farm areas. Some years back, in the time of John F. Kennedy, a dinner was held at the White House, and the dinner was held for Nobel laureates. Maybe some of you will recall that Pablo Casals played the cello, and it was a glorious occasion. And of course, Jackie Kennedy set a style at the time. It was very exciting, and JFK got up and toasted the assemblage at the time. And he said in 1962, "This is the most extraordinary collection of talent, of human knowledge that has ever been gathered together at the White House, with the possible exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined alone." Pretty good description. Ron Chernow, who writes some wonderful books, by the way, on American history and characters, he wrote a book about 4 years ago, a biography of Alexander Hamilton, who was at one time Jefferson's opponent in a lot of issues, especially having to do with fiscal policies. Ron Chernow summed up Jefferson a little bit this way, quote, "Both Hamilton and Jefferson believed in democracy, but Hamilton tended to be more suspicious of the governed and Jefferson of the governors." See a little spirit of rebellion there? A little spirit of rebellion. And Jefferson went on to say on several occasions when people were rioting or the Whiskey Rebellion broke out and things like that, Jefferson said something to the effect of, "A little rebellion now and then is good. It clears the air. It clears the air." It got out of control, of course. It got out of hand in France in the French Revolution, which made him back off, as I said earlier. But at first he thought it was the right thing to do. The people are in the streets. They have a king. They have a system that doesn't allow them to participate or even think for themselves. Let them do what they have to do. Tough talk, tough talk. We think we've channeled it pretty well today, but occasionally it bursts out in the streets, doesn't it? We see that all the time. At this point, I encourage you, by the way, to not only read some things about Jefferson, and there are plenty of books out there about him, but to think about his contribution to us here today. If Jefferson had not been interested in the West, and not all the presidents were particularly interested in the West, by the way, they were interested in the East Coast and Europe and a lot of other things, maybe we'd be a different kind of a country today. Jefferson was concerned about what was going to happen out here in the Columbia River country. He knew it was out here. You know, the Columbia River had, quote, already been discovered by a Spaniard, Bruno Heceta. Bruno Heceta did not go into the river, but he knew it was a river. Several others had seen it and knew it was a river. But eventually, of course, it was interrupted. It was intruded upon by sailors who got over that very treacherous Columbia Bar, and word got back to Jefferson. And he wanted to take advantage of what he saw as a main road right out to the riches of the Asian areas. One of the people that he admired was a man named Alexander Mackenzie. Alexander Mackenzie worked for the Northwest Company. Alexander Mackenzie was the first Euro-American to cross the North American continent mostly by water. It was not Lewis and Clark, although they did it too. They did it about 12 years later. Alexander Mackenzie went across and ended up, by the way, in the Arctic. He made a wrong turn. And then he ended up on the coast of British Columbia. But what he did was, and Jefferson always appreciated this, he wrote a journal. Jefferson read that journal, and Alexander Mackenzie said in it, "The country that gains control of these routes to the west and to the great South Sea," that's how they called the Pacific Ocean in those days, "is going to become very, very wealthy." Jefferson handed that to Meriwether Lewis and said, "This is our job. This is our job. Let's find out what's out there in Puget Sound and the Columbia River." And he didn't say Alaska, but he meant the North Pacific too, because a number of ships have been up there and explored it. I have to run away to another meeting, but I'm delighted to stay for a couple of minutes if you have a couple of questions. Is that fair enough, Carol? you have a couple of questions?
I just want to say something. Now that you know who Junius is and what he knows about history, he's been the one to write all the comments under the boxes I've been making. And I'm just delighted with the things that he says.
Thank you, Catherine, but you deserve the credit for that. You did the real work. Any other questions about Jefferson, or? There's a lot more to say about this man, but I allotted myself 45 minutes.
You didn't mention his inventions, and I've always been intrigued by his inventions.
Very good comment. How many of you have been to Monticello? Put your hands up. Ah, what a sight! The serpentine wall, the clock that goes through the ground. I remember when I was there, there was a pole I saw in a corner. The guide went over and took the pole out, pulled it apart. It was a ladder. Just like Benjamin Franklin, Jefferson never tired of experimenting. He also was very active in inventing things for agriculture, as was George Washington, interestingly enough. They both were tinkerers and came up with better plows and better systems to plow the ground. Yeah, you're right. Jefferson's mind was bubbling all the time. Maybe not to the extent of Benjamin Franklin, who saw no limits at all. And Benjamin Franklin was never president and did not have the responsibilities that Jefferson had, but they were both extraordinary. Good comment. Yes, Catherine?
The bed he had between the two rooms in Monticello. The people know about that.
Yeah.
Yes, and the air conditioning system.
Yes. Natural air conditioning. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Any legislative highlights or hallmarks of his administration?
Of Jefferson's administration? The major event of Jefferson's administration was sending the Lewis and Clark expedition west. The others were probably mistakes in many respects. He established a boycott, which annoyed the Federalists in New England no end. He also sent an expedition over to deal with the Barbary pilots in North Africa, which may or may not have been a good idea. We don't know. He had some success with it, I must say, and that's where, of course, the Marine hymn to the shores of Tripoli come from. He was very, very involved in ensuring that there be a separation of church and state. He reinforced it all the time in his statements and his writings, but of course that came from his experience in Virginia. That battle, if I can call it a battle, continues today, as I think you're all very much aware. But to Jefferson, it was a vital issue if people are going to subscribe to a free democracy. Otherwise, he had his hand in everything, but James Madison, who followed him, probably gets more credit for accomplishment in terms of legislation having to do with the establishment of our country than does Jefferson. Jefferson made a couple of big moves, as I described, but otherwise, it reminds me a little bit, by the way, of JFK and Lyndon Johnson. JFK was a hero to many and an exciting and attractive person, but it was Lyndon Johnson who got most of the legislation passed and had the best arrangements and best relationships with Congress. I think it was the same with Madison, who followed. Anything else? Well, thank you very much. Enjoy this day. Thank you, Carl.
That's it.
That's him.